It gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's conversation because she's a very good friend and a colleague, Dr. Susan Appe, Associate Professor and MPA Program Director in the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy here at UAlbany. She is a widely published scholar on diaspora philanthropy, centered on the transnational nexus of migration, development, and philanthropy. She's been the recipient of 5 Fulbright Scholar Awards in countries spanning from South America to the Middle East. She's a returned Peace Corps volunteer, Macedonia and Bolivia, and is active in UAlbany's Peace Corps Prep program. She serves on the boards of Refugees and Immigrant Support Services, Emmaus, or RISE, and the Albany Barn, a community arts center in Arbor Hill, the Albany Barn in Arbor Hill. For this work and much more, Dr. Appe was honored with the 2024 President's Award for Exemplary Public Engagement at UAlbany. Please welcome Dr. Susan Appe.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome again our guests, and I want to share a little bit about their bios, which you might be familiar with, before I ask them to join me on the stage for what should be a very enlightening conversation. Robert D. Kaplan has written 23 books, and I found out just now that he's on his 24th, which is forthcoming. Books on foreign affairs and travel that include titles such as The Loom of Time in 2023, The Revenge of Geography in 2012, The Coming Anarchy in 1994, based on the same titled article in The Atlantic, and The Balkan Ghosts from 1993. For 3 decades, he reported on foreign affairs for The Atlantic, and Foreign Policy magazine twice named him one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. His newest book, which is available here tonight, titled Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis, offers an exploration of a world in which every regional disaster threatens to become a global conflict, featuring lessons from history that we'll talk about tonight that may help us stop the spiral. We also welcome Bartle Bull, who has reported from the Middle East for publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and many other publications. He is the only Western journalist to have been embedded with the Shia militia known as the Mahdi Army in Iraq. He is the author of the 2024 Land Between Rivers, a 5,000-year history of Iraq, an epic 5 millennia history of the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, the birthplace of civilization, and an essential crossroads between the East and the West, even up until today. We have these 2 thinkers who have thought a lot about civilization, its birth, and its threats, both pending and actual. And I want to make mention that the title of this panel, or our gathering tonight, has a bit of a grim framing, right? Balancing on the brink of chaos, America's foreign policy future. And so our guests indeed have considered war, climate change, the great powers over history and their decline, rapid technological advancement, and the decline of societies more broadly, among other very, very pressing topics. So we are going to discuss these around how we got here and where we're going, we as a nation, as the U.S. and the world. And so I'd like to invite our guest to the stage. Yeah. Okay, welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to start the conversation broadly. Both of your recent books rest on the premise that we can learn from history, right? Robert, you start your book off with the Weimar Republic, a democratic government in Germany that lasted from 1918 to 1933, in between the 2 world wars, and suggest that this time period is instructive to us today. Bartle, you go back a bit further to 2700 BC, to Uruk, where is right now southern Iraq, I believe, where civilization by Sumerians was born and urbanization emerged. And so for those in the audience who haven't had the chance yet to read your book, can you describe a bit more about your approach and about these really historical launching points that you took that help develop your arguments and help achieve the goals of your book itself? Why don't we start with Robert, if that's okay?
Yes, do you all hear me? Yes, all right, yeah, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight, with Susan and with Bartle. And I'd like to start it this way. It's a matter of geographical scale. The world today is in a place where over the past few decades, technology has not defeated geography, it has shrunk geography. So that the world is smaller, more anxious, more claustrophobic, and more urbanized than it's ever been before in history. And so that a crisis in one part of the earth can affect other parts of the earth to a degree unknown in the past. It's just, there's a saying, attrition of the same adds up to big change. We don't have world governance, and we don't have a world government, but we do have an emerging world system. And that system is not good, it's not bad, it's just a system of interacting continents and states. And I compare it to the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic lasted, as Susan said, from the end of World War I to the ascension of Adolf Hitler in 1933. And it sprawled across Central and Eastern Europe. It took in all of Germany as well as East Prussia and other places. It was a big landmass. And at the end of World War I, with Germany defeated, a large group of legislators and lawyers met in the Thuringen town in central Germany of Weimar. And their goal was to devise a constitution that would make sure that Germany would never again have an autocrat like Kaiser Wilhelm or like Otto von Bismarck. So what happened was typical in history and in our lives. They overlearned the lesson, something we all do periodically. And so they created a system, a system that nobody could govern, essentially, that was always in crisis, that had no strong leader, that had constant bickering and argument, so that nobody was ever really in control. And that, to me, is a metaphor taken to the geographical scale of the earth of the world today. The world today is like a Weimar. Now, let me say, this is not a gloom and doom scenario, because Weimar had a lot of happy periods. It had a lot of optimism. It could have turned out vastly different than it did, and I go into that in the book. It did not have to end in the way that it did. And so our world today, will not have the same trajectory as Weimar, but it is a Weimar world in the sense that nobody is in control, and everyone and every state is interacting with every other state.
Thank you. Bartle, in thinking about not so much the analogy of, such as Robert says, of Weimar, but you start in 2700, and so why is that an important starting point for the story that you tell?
So we start in 2700 BC in southern Iraq because that's where certainly the argument that I make, which a lot of us are familiar with, I make an argument that a lot of us are familiar with already, I'm sure from grade school, even if we don't really remember it. But I think it's an argument that definitely can be made that civilization begins in that part of the world then. There are other great early civilizations that emerge not very long after that from what is now India to Egypt. But really, if civilization is cities with lasting architecture, organized states, the kivis based on the city, that's really where it begins. And why is that? One is that writing is so very important. So what Robert and I do, it's part of a thing that's been at the heart of civilization from the very beginning. In a practical sense, first, you needed to be able to keep track of the labor of people who were building canals and buildings and so on, trade, etc. Writing's really at the heart of it. But there's something very special in the south of Iraq, which is the geography, the importance, as Robert's reminded us many times in different books, the extraordinary importance of geography. So the geography of Iraq is very unusual. These two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, they flow down from the mountains of Armenia and Turkey, and in the spring have enormous floods that brings down the silt. And so that floodplain of Iraq is well watered, but these floods are violent, and it takes enormous organization to channel these waters, to protect people from the floods, but also to irrigate and so on. And so it starts there with again that wonderful point of Robert's over decades of frequently the primacy of geography in these great events.
Yeah, I mentioned to Robert earlier that I'll steal a phrase of his, this idea of technology in particular being able to compress geography, right? That being a really important running theme, and I think probably across the history of Iraq as well, technology broadly defined, not thinking just digital technology, which we tend to think about, but how have we seen the interaction of geography with technology across, as you narrate in your books, in Iraq, and then in the story of Wasteland?
Well, in Wasteland, of course, is based on T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. And I think the poem's quite beautiful. So everyone tells me my new book is bleak, but I don't see it as bleak, because when I think of the poem Wasteland, I think it's very nice. Yes, there was a great Hungarian-American mathematician and polymath of the early mid-20th century named John von Neumann, who is a character in Wasteland. And he was brilliant. He could quote Thucydides, he spoke languages, and he also worked on the Manhattan Project, building the atomic bomb, and later building the hydrogen bomb. He had an idea. He said that the Earth cannot get any bigger, but technology keeps growing. So the very finite or limited size of the Earth will eventually become a force for instability in the world. And he was really, in a way, taking off from a great British geographer of 120 years ago, Sir Halford Mackinder. And Mackinder said that, Mackinder, in a sense, intuited, he didn't predict, but he suggested both world wars decades before they happen. Because he said that the great European empires had mapped out the entire earth. There's no place that is accounted for anymore. Every place in Africa has been taken up by the colonialists, every place in Latin America, and on it goes. So that the great powers have nothing further to do except fight each other. And he said, and so he predicted that there would be 2 world wars because he predicted the First World War, and when it ended, he said, we're still not finished because we have a belt of countries between Russia and Germany which are weak and unstable, and they will be fought over in another world war. So Mackinder and John von Neumann, using geography, essentially were able to figure out, where history was going. It was a matter of filling up the earth, and then once the earth was filled up, and by filled up means not every place is a city, they meant every place was territorially accounted for. There was nothing else to do except fight among themselves in Europe.
I find that a little grim. But I hear you. The poem itself is not. How about in the history of Iraq in terms of technological advancements, and how might that have interacted with geography in the storyline?
Yeah, Susan, it's so fun to have this difference in this difference in the length or scale of our perspectives makes this really fun. Yeah. So, looking at this huge sweep of thousands of years, we can choose a storyline with regard to technology and science. Of kind of very big things that might not even appear to be technology. So certainly writing is an initial kind of killer app. Another, but we've discussed that. Another one though that occurs to me is numbers. So we know the types of numbers that we use as Arabic numbers. They were more properly known as the moda in Latin as the modus indorum. They were Indian originally, adopted by the Arabs, who Europeans then in early medieval times discovered trading in North Africa. So Fibonacci, his father was a Venetian, I think, merchant, who discovers this in Algiers or something, the modus indorum, and they with the number 0, cipher, and they bring that home, and merchants are immensely empowered by math that's so much easier to do than with Roman numerals, right? I mean, the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, so much in Western civilization would have been so much slower and harder without this. Another interesting technology, so to speak, that I came across in this book, a very different type of example, the Macedonian phalanx, okay, which Alexander the Great, who inherits his throne from his father, Philip, who's the greatest, really, politician of ancient Greece. He's the only one who manages to conquer all these other Greek city-states, including Athens, Philip of Macedon. And Philip has developed the Macedonian phalanx into something that's unbeaten across the world for centuries after that. And that's a form of technology. What they have is these 16-foot spears. That's very simple. But the drill of a unit of men to fight coherently with these, the drill, the training of what commands and how to respond to them, that was something that the Macedonians guarded as a technological secret. Yeah. And there are lots of these other stories, but those are just a couple of examples of different ways of looking at technology.
Yeah.
Always important, though.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have a separate question for each of you. I'll start with Robert. Much to my delight, in the book, Jane Jacobs appears, the urban writer and activist, right? And I would like you to tell the audience a little bit about how that happens, why that happens, and how she's influenced your thinking.
Yes, Jane Jacobs was a Canadian-American urban specialist. And she wrote a great classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And I was introduced to Jane Jacobs by my late editor at Random House, Jason Epstein, for whom Jane Jacobs had written for in an earlier era. Jane Jacobs essentially had this great line that I loved, which is, a city is not about beautiful buildings, it's not about wealth, it's about sidewalks. If a city's sidewalks are interesting, then the city is interesting. And if you only see the same kind of people on the sidewalk, or everyone is all dressed in a similar way, the city is not interesting, no matter how much wealth it has. And I bring in Jane Jacobs because in the third part of my book, I talk about the effect of human habitation, of urbanization upon geopolitics. Because in cities, everything is experienced at a much more intense level than elsewhere. So if we're going to have a human population that's 70% urban, it's going to and that could mean a glittering new city, it could mean a mega slum in the developing world or something like that, whatever. Life and geopolitics are going to be experienced at a much more intense level. Again, it's the intensity of it. Attrition of the same adds up to big change. So what I try to do, of course, is to define what makes cities work, and what makes them not work. And Jane Jacobs does this better than anyone, and that's why her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is a classic, and why I weave her into my narrative.
Yeah, and you weave it, to the reader at least, very effortlessly. It makes a lot of sense why you're discussing that in the context of urbanization and thinking about that. Bartle, I think everyone in the room is curious how one goes about writing 5,000 years of history, right? And you say, and I really like this in your book, you say that your intention is, quote, not to tell the stories of our time, but to provide their background. And you make some really specific decisions, one of which, and we talked about just before coming in here this evening, is to end the 5,000 years at 1958. And so if you could share a bit with the audience about the process of writing 5,000 years of history and some of those choices of kind of what was the choice of the span of that history.
Sure, Susan. So that's a question that can involve matters of the sources, but also your approach. How are you going to write this? How are you going to make it interesting? On that latter point, what I do, because this can just be such a enormous amount of information, and no one wants to read a kind of lecture, is that I mostly, chapter by chapter, try to tell individual stories. So my chapter about the early 20th century, we tell the story of Iraq's first king, King Faisal I. I might say more about him later. Early on, we tell the story of Gilgamesh and others along the way. Okay, so these individual narratives that hopefully keep it moving, that make it ideally compelling to read. And then how do we write this? One great thing about these individuals is you then get a lot of primary material, memoirs, later on in history, but also the records in cuneiform and so on. An enormous amount of that has been translated. So as a writer who can't be an academic specialist in more than the material of a page of a book like this, really, you can still use a great deal of primary research, because even if it's in translation, it's still that original text. But of course, much of the time, you're also standing on the shoulders of other historians who've come before. Iraq was this burning issue for all Americans, until as of fairly recently, maybe a decade ago, right? We just all remember it. We all have our opinions about it. And it was important to me to stop before that point in Iraq's history, because I didn't want the reader's experience of the rest of the book infected by his or her view of what the writer wrote about that last period. And in the huge sweep of 5,000 years, which is utterly full of wars and violence and so on, the name of one dictator for 20 years barely matters at all. And so 1958, where we end, is when the last king of Iraq in its brief post-World War I monarchy is, with his family, slaughtered in the garden of a palace in Baghdad, 1958. And so a fascinating moment that started right after World War I of great hope in that country ends, and we have a descent into a series of despots whose names barely matter in the sweep of things.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned how in your book and in Wasteland, I see that there's a lot of interweaving of stories of individuals, right? And I think some of the argument that the books are making is that individuals make history, right? Individuals make governing decisions. And so can you share, you've already talked about Alexander the Great, but can you share another story that's in the 5,000 years that you think is an exceptional or sheds light on the history of Iraq?
Yeah, sure, Susan, great question. I mean, so, I discovered a couple of great individuals. Certainly the story of Gilgamesh is well worth reading again for anybody. A really interesting character, and maybe, Robert, you've come across him, was Iraq's first king, this character, Faisal I of Iraq. A fascinating man. His family, didn't come from anywhere near Iraq. They were the Sharifs of Mecca, and his father was the last of those. And so they are Arabs who lived for centuries, of course, under the Ottomans. In the Second World War, the Ottomans are on the side of the Germans. The British support an Arab uprising against the Turks. That's the story of Lawrence of Arabia. And Faisal, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, is a very talented and brave leader of the Arab revolt in the desert against the Turkish overlord. And when they have to settle what happens to this Ottoman Empire in Paris in 1919, 1920, for Iraq, any local leader will be too controversial with the different, he'll be from the wrong sect or the wrong religion entirely or the wrong tribe. They bring in this Faisal, and it's about as hard a task as a man has ever been given, and he's a person of extraordinary personal diplomacy, cunning, intelligence, and so on, and he essentially works himself to death. When he dies, it's really ultimately of exhaustion after his years of trying to manage forming a state out of what Churchill calls, Robert will remember, the ungrateful volcano of these, the ungrateful volcano of these three former Ottoman provinces. But anyway, he's a really fun character, and in my view, an admirable one to look into.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have a
Yes,
comment?
over the years and decades, I've learned that it's all about geography until it becomes all about Shakespeare. And, the point of that is we deal with vast impersonal forces of geography and trade and natural resources and populations. But often history turns on a meeting between one or two or three people, or a wink and a nod, or if this case, the Weimar Republic ended that way. Had one or two of the figures of late Weimar had different talents than they had, there would have been no Hitler, essentially. And so I give a lot of primacy to individuals in Wasteland. And the individual that I'd just like to mention for a minute or two is Deng Xiaoping, who was the paramount leader of China from the mid-late 1970s into the early 1990s. At the turn of the 21st century in 2000, there was all this discussion among Western elites, who was the greatest man of the 20th century? Was it Churchill? Was it Roosevelt? Was it Einstein? I would say Deng Xiaoping. And the reason why Deng was never discussed was for two reasons. One, he was not Western, he was Chinese, so he was off their radar screen. The other is because Western elites see progress only in terms of human freedom and liberty, whereas for silent billions of people across the earth, progress is putting food on the table, having clothes to dress with, and having just basic physical safety and security away from gangs and thugs, etc. Never before in human history has one man so dramatically raised the standard of living of more people in a quicker period of time than Deng Xiaoping did in China. Deng inherited Mao's China, and Mao's China was a place of anarchy, utter poverty, unrest, collapsed institutions because of the depredations of the great proletariat cultural revolution. And Deng essentially did something very smart, very nifty. He didn't institute democracy. That was the last thing he wanted to do. He wanted to be he emerged as the opposite of Gorbachev. Gorbachev essentially liberated both the politics first and then the economy, and the result was the collapse of a whole empire and state. Deng liberated the economy, but not the politics, because he knew that China was not ready for democracy, it was not ready for full-scale capitalism, it would have to be a gradual change. Deng was a gradualist, essentially. He was an enlightened conservative like Edmund Burke, and others. And as a result, Deng changed for the better, dramatically for the better, hundreds of millions of lives in China. And that's why Deng, when Deng was in power and his successors who thought like he did, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, China had good relations with the United States and the outside world. China had friends in Washington, friends in the media, because it was an enlightened, conservative, risk-averse, collegial form of authoritarianism, not the Leninist autocracy that you have now in China.
Yeah, thank you. And China appears in the history of Iraq. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then we'll bring it to more current foreign affairs.
Yeah, so one of the great things about studying Iraq is that it's this absolutely essential crossroads from the very beginning for thousands of years. And so just as developments from India with these numbers appear, an utterly essential one, also a technology that itself was fiercely guarded, is paper that they get, and silk, of course, coming across from China, and the trade going both ways. So it appears a lot, the great Abbasid Empire that was in Baghdad at that famous time of the kind of medieval glories, the glories of the medieval Islamic world. The really moment we're referring to is this caliphate in Baghdad called the Abbasids. And their trade with the East is enormous. So it's, I discover writing this and researching this is something I had a hunch about, but I do think we end up with certainly a case to be made for this part of this being the axial land, as much as anywhere could claim to be that, and so this story takes us all the way east to China and all the way west to Western Europe, back and forth all the time across the millennia.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Given both of your interests in that our discussion is intending to address foreign affairs and policy, I want to preface this with my next question is going to be about U.S. foreign aid, so don't talk about that yet. But that I'm curious if there's something in particular that you are paying attention to in the headlines over the course of the last several weeks, whether it's out of the U.S. or elsewhere. What are you paying attention to related to foreign affairs?
Well, one thing, there's so much to pay attention to. So if you mention one thing, you'll think, well, what about all the other things, you know, in all of this? What I'm paying attention to is two things. What is going to happen with the Ukraine war? Because I always felt that whoever was elected, Biden or Trump, there would be some sort of a negotiation in 2025. It's just that Biden denied that there might be one. Trump said that there would be one. But even Biden's advisors who would have staffed the Kamala Harris administration were planning for this very thing. And if it's possible to get like a truce, an armistice. Remember, the Korean War never ended. There's just been an armistice in place for the last 70 years or 72 years. So, you know, if something like that was going to happen in Ukraine, because Russia has been fighting in Ukraine for almost 3 years this month, and it has lost tens of thousands of men, hundreds, must be close to 200,000, many thousands of tanks, and every month that the war in Ukraine goes on, it weakens the Russian hold on the Caucasus, Central Asia, Siberia, and the Russian Far East. So the empire is slowly crumbling, even as all manpower and elite attention is placed on Ukraine. So I'm watching that closely. And then just one other thing, I'm watching China. And the reason is because, Trump is capable of anything. He can have a trade war with China. He could make friends with China. He can strike a deal. I'm wondering how the Chinese are reacting to this, because one of the problems the Chinese have had is they don't know how to analyze Trump. He's something, they don't know how to analyze him. They don't know how to predict him, and this has caused them a lot of stress.
Thank you. Bartle, what are you paying attention to in the headlines?
So I think a lot about a couple of big strategic things. We're all familiar with the daily issues. With regard to China, clearly, in terms of foreign policy, I think that almost every question has to be seen in that light. As the last Cold War, then it was irresponsible to see almost anything outside of the matrix of that key competition that we were in. And sometimes I think about potential for is there potential for the great geostrategic historical move of detaching, shall we say, Russia from the Chinese orbit? This war in Ukraine is almost making Russia a Chinese vassal. Yeah. And China has so much more, Russia has so much more to fear from China than it does from us. Essentially, we are essentially as benign as a hegemon has ever been, or any great power. But moreover, the history of China and Russia is one that makes the Chinese threat one of the most visceral, fundamental elements of the Russian character. There's no analog in our life in our world of this. Since the time of Genghis Khan, an immense amount of Russian culture and of the inner Russian thought has been about this threat from the East, and it's a physical threat, the emptying out of the Russian Orient, and China's inroads there, and so on. I mean, I wonder if there's potential. I think there is potential for some kind of strategic realignment. Very difficult to achieve, but something to keep an eye on. Another thing on my mind a lot is the potential culturally of Iran as an ally. It's something that comes across very strongly in all my studies, and I hope it comes across in this book, just how compatible or potentially friendly ancient Persian or Persian culture and traditional Shia Islam before the Ayatollah came with his new take on it in 1979. Persian culture and the West are in very many ways that I wish I had more time to get into natural friends, and I think there's enormous potential there. A couple of very big picture things I like to keep an eye on.
Can I just react to that? I would agree and go even further. I would almost predict that over the next few years, the big change in the Middle East, a real world historical change, will be the end of the clerical system in Iran. Remember, when the Shah was in power for decades, his family, nobody could imagine an Iran without the Shah. Experts were saying, oh, but he's weak, he's unpopular, and people said, no. And then, boom, the clerical regime came in 1979, and now nobody can imagine a regime beyond the clerics. And I think we need to use our imagination here. That Iran, as Bartle said, could, sooner than you think, change and be an ally of the West. But I think the regime has never been weaker than it is now, and you will have, if that happens, you will have 85 million Iranians unleashed into the global economy. They haven't, Iran has been hidden from the global economy because of this really incompetent regime, which has destroyed the currency, destroyed the middle class, destroyed the infrastructure. It will go down in history as one of Persia's worst regimes, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Some of the last 2 weeks, so we have in this audience, I think, hopefully returned Peace Corps volunteers, Fulbrighters, people who have studied abroad, gone away outside of the U.S., and U.S. foreign aid has been in the news over the last 2 weeks, and this is something I care about. I write about aid reduction and withdrawal and the implication it has on international NGOs, their local partners, and the people they serve. I've written about that. You both have traveled extensively, written extensively in many aid-receiving countries. And so I'm curious if you can reflect a bit on the role of U.S. foreign assistance, maybe in the present, in the past, where you see it going in the future.
Should I?
Yeah, Robert, why don't you
All right. You have to look at U.S. foreign aid. The U.S. Agency for International Development is one of the pillars of the post-war order. The post-war order was composed of NATO, of our treaty alliances with the Pacific, and the soft American power of foreign aid. Remember, aid has been in existence since the Kennedy administration in 1961, which was still the early middle point of the Cold War. And it was used, as a way to strengthen allies, to win friends, to do a lot of things that didn't require military assistance. And I think, but remember, keep this in mind, in the early Cold War, the United States accounted for 50% of the globe's manufacturing capacity. It now accounts for 16%. America is comparatively weaker and poorer to the rest of the world than it was at the end of World War II and the early Cold War. So America had a lot of money to spend. It was wealthy. It was building this enormous engine of a middle class. And then, well, we could talk all night about America and what's happened to the middle class and all of that, but I think we're at the end of the post-war order, and the attacks on foreign aid are part of that.
Thank you. Bartle, what do you think?
Yeah, from the perspective I look at, nothing does last forever, and we find ourselves wrenchingly in new historical moments, and that's really never ending. With regards, and I agree that this is, and so in a certain sense, this is structured this way anyway. It's an artifact. That said, this country has interests. And those don't go away. I think that I happen to agree with the president and his team that the obligation of elected people anywhere is to their people. So I think all of this is rightly seen rigorously through the lens of the national interest. And if after so many decades, it's quite natural for me to see a certain structure get tired, and I expect that we'll see from the new administration that American money can still advance American interests, and I expect a lot of this will be ultimately will be replaced, but it will be subjected to that, in my view, understandable standard of it serving the national interest.
Yeah, I would add to that nothing gradually, there's this old cliche from Ernest Hemingway's first novel, The Sun Also Rises, when a character is asked, how did you go bankrupt? And the guy responds, well, first gradually, then suddenly, and history is like that in many ways. Things don't end nicely. There's a decline for years and years, and then something breaks. And I think we're in one of those periods now.
Thank you. I think maybe we want to open it up for a few questions. I know we're at time.
Yeah, I have a microphone I can bring around, so if you have a question, raise your hand. We have to
Before
start
I
over
give
here.
them the last word.
Okay.
Maybe introduce yourself.
Yeah. My name is Akhenaton. I go to Rockefeller College studying political science and public policy. I'm doing a combined degree program, so bachelor's and master's. And regarding basically one of the last things that you said about declining and at some point it's gonna break, and also nothing lasts forever. But I feel like the US has been declining for several years. And also going back to one of the quotes that Bo said about him going back to 5,000 years back, it's not only to know about the story, but also to know the background. And one of the things that we can mention is that when knowing the background, there was already a lot of issues there. So I guess from 5,000 years till now, we're still accumulating issues and issues. So if America was built on a soil that we believe we have the best democracy, which in parentheses is we just have the system, we just have the perfect system, but I don't think we have the population following the actual democracy. So why are we accepting the decline and not trying to fix what we have to fix?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think your part two in your book, when you're talking about the decline of the great powers, including the US and then also China and Russia, might shed some light in this.
Yeah, well, what I write essentially is that decline itself can be overrated because it takes so long and is so gradual. The British Royal Navy began to decline in the 1890s. And that was the general arbiter of British power, the strength of the Royal Navy. And yet that did not stop Britain from essentially saving the world 50 years later in 1940. The real British, you didn't really see this decline that began in the 1890s until after World War II in the late 1940s, when Britain had no more money to run the empire. The empire disappeared. The Americans came in with aid for Greece and Turkey because the British couldn't afford to do it anymore. So that, decline can take time. And also, decline is relative. How is American decline compared to Chinese decline? And I think China is in decline now. And compared to Russian decline, which is far more sudden and severe, I believe. So America could be in decline, but at the same time increasing its power in relation to China and Russia.
Shall we take another question?
Speaking a question over here. Okay.
Oh gosh, so many questions. Maybe we'll take
Hi.
a couple.
I'm Fred Pfeiffer from Albany. Could you speak on any correlations between freedom and democracy and innovation and economic prosperity versus economic prosperity, as you mentioned, under Deng Xiaoping? Which do you think is most efficient?
Okay, maybe we'll take a couple questions, or would you rather?
It's up to you.
Okay, maybe just a couple questions, and then that gives you some leeway of what you.
Okay.
What you
yeah.
Okay.
Who else? Just a couple, just because I know we're going to run out of time, right? Yeah. So
I had the chance to read Revenge of Geography, which really fascinated me, and talk about the map of the world and about the U.S. relationships with Mexico and Canada. So can you give us some update to that?
Okay. Maybe one more. One more. And then.
My name is Bill Colgan. I live here in Albany. It's been 80 years now since the great powers made war directly on one another. In the wee hours of the morning, what do you think the odds are we're going to get through the next 75 years of this century without great power war?
Okay.
All right. What are you predicting, and how do you want to answer? We have a question on democracy and economic development, under democracy or not, Mexico and Canada, and then are we on the brink of another great power war? Who wants in?
But it does feel like more your question.
All right. Okay.
More interested in what you have to say.
Okay. I'll just go quickly through this. This is a very contentious question about democracy and freedom versus economic progress. Keep in mind, the record in Asia has been to have economic progress through authoritarians, and then once a middle class has been established, and I'm using South Korea, Singapore, and other places and Taiwan as an example, that that authoritarians developed a middle class, and then once there was a middle class, democracy sprouted and has been fairly substantial and stable ever since. And the reason is because once you have a middle class, people fight and argue in elections over economic things, not about tribal identity or ethnic identity or something like that. Mexico and Canada. I think, I'm just speculating here, that manifest destiny in American history has gone from east to west. And President Trump thinks geographically in the sense of manifest destiny now going from north to south, from Greenland to the Panama Canal, in an age of a warming Arctic and more naval activity up in the Arctic. So I think that's how he sees it. Remember, we've had a North American Free Trade Pact since the mid-1990s that has brought Canada and Mexico into a market with dominated by the United States. If there is a trade war with Canada and Mexico, the beneficiary could be China, because that's the way that it would work. And what was the third question?
The next World War?
Oh, yeah.
Simple.
Well, the very fact that you could ask that question seriously, and it is a serious question, shows the danger. Because if there wasn't a danger, nobody would pose the question. But it's being posed often. Nowadays. Ukraine is unique because it's the first time since the end of World War II that Russia, the Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States have been directly on the opposite sides of a conflict. It's not a proxy war or like someplace in the developing world. It's Russia is fighting a war and the U.S. is spending billions to arm the other side. That's as close as you can get to great power conflict. And I think one thing I'll say is financial markets have very impressively priced in 20, 25 years of conflict in the Middle East. They've priced in the Ukraine war. Nobody has noticed much changes on their retirement accounts because of wars in the Middle East or Ukraine. But if you had a high-end military conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan or the South China Sea, it would have a devastating effect on world markets.
Thank you. I think maybe, Bartle, do you have any comments on that? Or I know we're getting to time, right? Well, I want you each to have the last word, but we have to do it sequentially just because of logistics. But what do you want the audience to be thinking about related to your most current work or related to foreign affairs in a couple sentences, leaving here.
I suppose the ebb and flow of great empires and the, frankly, eternally ugly, conflict-ridden nature of things. I must say, answering this question about war in the next 75 years, it would be one way to look at it is just that it has never happened, that hasn't been the case. And so then what, if anything, has truly changed? That's what we have to ask ourselves. We can ask ourselves about the flashpoints and the players and so on. But also, I think that long view is really instructive. It's a jungle out there. Has the nature of anything changed? Perhaps, but you have to answer that question, I think, to have a view that nature of things has changed.
Yeah, I would echo that. That's absolutely true. I would just add, use your imagination. There is a character in Tolstoy's War and Peace, Count Rasputtin, who could analyze, know logically that Napoleon could invade Moscow and Moscow could burn in 1812, but he couldn't imagine it. He couldn't imagine it actually happening. So that when it did happen, he was as lost as anybody. So just imagine things. The one thing I'm imagining, as I said, is the end of the clerical regime in Iran.
Susan, do you have anything else?
No, I just wanted to thank them
Yes.
and just say that this was quite the honor to be on stage with you.
Yes, let's thank Bartle Bull, Robert D. Kaplan, Dr. Susan Appe. You can line up by that wall if you have books. You can also come up and say hello to the authors. Please, books for sale from Bookhouse. Do not come here tomorrow night. There won't be a film. That was my bad. Friday night, Becoming Frederick Douglass right here. But one more time, what a brilliant, we could have been here another hour. What a brilliant conversation. Bartle Bull, Robert D. Kaplan, Dr. Susan Appe.